Hey, konbanwa. It's good to be with you this evening, and thank you for taking the time on a Friday night to be with us, and I hope that this will be useful for you. Let me share my screen. Okay. So critical thinking is always a topic that people ask for help about because, as everyone knows, this is a big push in Japan to add critical thinking into your classrooms. But I need to be honest, as I have prepared for this, it was a difficult one to prepare for because critical thinking is such a large topic, and there's so much that I could have shared with you that I wasn't sure where to start. So I'm going to start from the perspective of someone who is just starting out and they're not sure how to incorporate it into their classrooms, and some advice for people like that. I will also at the end give some suggestions for people who are ready for more. And so I hope that something will be useful for you. So by the end of this webinar, you will have reflected upon your own critical thinking as an educator and also learned strategies for how to add it into your classrooms. So let's just start with a simple definition of what we're thinking about when we think of critical thinking. So individuals must ask questions, invent new ways of solving problems, connect new knowledge to the information they already have, and apply their knowledge to new situations. So of course, this is what we are being tasked to get our students to do with critical thinking. But first, we need to figure out, are we as educators thinking critically? So we need to first model that in our own lives so that we can better help our students to do that. So critical thinking must start with us. So when we think about what that means for an educator, these are some of the things that I think we should be thinking about. So a critical thinking educator, teacher, is flexible and can adapt plans to fit the student's needs. So if you're critically thinking as a teacher, you don't plan out your lessons for the whole month because you know that you have to pay attention to how your students are responding to what you're doing in the class, and that you will have to adapt. Often I teach multiple sections of the same class. I never teach it in the same way because I have different students. They respond differently to what I'm teaching. And so you have to adapt and be ready to change your plans. Also, this teacher avoids teacher-centered lessons, and we've talked about this quite a bit. So you avoid that and you put the focus on the student, and you become a facilitator of learning. You are not the one that just passes on knowledge or information, but you design your classes so that you facilitate the students' learning. You also collaborate with other teachers. You work together. You put your heads together to figure out what needs to happen. You collaborate, you share ideas, you work together. You embrace ambiguity, and this is really difficult because you have to be okay with things not going exactly as you plan. So when students don't respond well, you have to embrace that and say, okay, what is my role? Because my goal is to help my students. So you need to embrace that, oh, I don't know if this is going to work, but we're going to try it. So that is something that's critical about someone who's thinking critically in the classroom. You also realize that there is no one way to do something. So many times I have teachers say, just tell me what to do. And I can't do that because I don't know your students, I don't know your context. So there are multiple ways to do things. And so in a webinar like this, the hope is that you will take ideas and then adapt it to your specific context, because there is no one way to do something. And this teacher also fosters student independence. That is our goal for critically thinking students, is that they think on their own and they can do things on their own without needing us to tell them exactly what to do. So I encourage you to think about, are you able to do these things? I know sometimes I'm not able to do all of those things, but we need to be striving to be critically thinking teachers. So that's the first place we need to start, is with our own critical thinking. We also need to think about culture, because critical thinking has been something that has been asked for you to add to your classes, but it's not been a part of Japanese classrooms, from what I can tell. So there was a study where people asked Japanese students, why don't you ask questions? And this will not be new for you. You have heard this from your own students, I'm sure. I don't want to look stupid. That's universal, right? Everyone around the world, nobody wants to look stupid no matter what country you're from. I don't have questions. I've heard this from Japanese students before, and I'm pretty sure that's not true. Everyone has questions. It could be something else that keeps them from asking a question. I'm not confident in my English. This is a big one. As we know, students lack confidence in their English. So I'd like us to think about what part culture plays in this. So in Asian classrooms in general, I worked a lot with Chinese students as well, and Korean students. The power dynamic in the classroom favors the teacher. The teacher is the one that is right. The teacher is the one that holds the information that they need to get. And so that power dynamic favors the teacher. And so it's easier for students to feel like they don't have a voice. We also need to think about critical thinking is process oriented. It's about the process. It's about working toward a goal. It's not about the goal. Traditional education is about that goal. For example, the entrance exam, right? That's the goal. And so education is designed to meet that goal. But critical thinking is not that black and white. It's all about the process of learning, of asking questions, of discovering, of creating. And so that's very difficult in an Asian classroom and in a Japanese classroom, right? Because we don't have that fixed answer, that fixed goal we're looking for. So it's a big shift in mindset. And the reason that I talk about this is because getting your students to become critical thinkers will take time. I sense a lot of frustration when I went to schools and we talked about critical thinking. It's like, they don't ask questions. They don't do it. They don't want to do it. It's so hard to get them to talk. It's going to take time. And so because this is such a huge shift, give yourself some grace and also your students some grace, and plan for it to take time. And lower your expectations that it's going to happen quickly, because it won't. Unless you just have students that are ready for it, maybe they are, but in general, this is going to take time. So, where to begin? As I said, I've imagined the teacher that is just starting out with critical thinking. They don't know where to start. And so this is where I would begin if I were talking to that teacher. I would talk about these three things. First, I would encourage that teacher to supplement what you already have. So that means your textbooks. That means everything that you already use in your classrooms that maybe aren't great for critical thinking, but you can add on, even just a little bit, you can add on. So use what you already have so that you're not just recreating everything. The second one I would recommend is to make questioning a regular practice. In every single class session, add some kind of questioning if you haven't already. And then the third one is to consider Bloom's taxonomy. I don't know if this is a new term for you. Some of you, I'm sure, have read about it or know about it. But this is a very critical tool for us as educators when we think about how to move our students toward more critical thinking. So let's dive into the first one. So supplement your textbook. If you are in a public school, then you have those MEXT mandated textbooks, and some of them are really getting better with the questions, but you can just add on. You could add open-ended questions to the reading. I worked with some schools when I was in Japan, and I looked at their textbook and I just added a few things here and there to what they already have. And open-ended questions is a big one. And we're going to talk more about this. Questions that don't have just one right answer, or they have to think about the answer. So I would add those. Design a project to go along with a unit. So you have your unit in your book. Add a little project at the end that makes it more applicable to real life. So you could just add something like that to the end of your unit. Find connections between the content in your textbook and your students' lives. Most of the time you can do this, like even if it's about climate change or elementary school, I watched one teacher do something about directions. You know, you can always find a connection between what they're talking about in the unit and the students' actual lives. So look for those. And then find real world applications, how they can apply what they read about in their book to actual real life usage of English, because that will help with their ability to think critically. So use the textbook that you already have. So one unit that I saw a lot in Japan was about Malala, the girl from Pakistan who was shot by the Taliban when she was 16. So this is an example of how I would supplement that. What would you have done if you were Malala and new people were against you? Sorry, that should be you. What would you have done? So you're putting the student in her shoes. What would you have done? This could just be a quick question to add to your class. You don't have to change everything to make every single thing you're doing critical thinking. You can just add a little bit here and there. Why do you think the Taliban wanted to harm her? So asking why questions is really important, because a lot of times in the book it just says the Taliban shot her, but we don't really think about why. These are some projects you could add. Write a letter of encouragement to the girls of Pakistan who want to go to school safely. So the whole reason she was injured and shot was because they didn't want girls to go to school. So write a letter of encouragement from one student to another student. The second one I really like, imagine you are Malala. So again, put yourself in her shoes. What would you say to Japanese students if you were her? So again, they're imagining themselves outside of their own experience, which is so important. This one is so great for teenagers because Malala was 16 when she was shot. So if you have high schoolers, you could say she was your age, she was around your age. Compare and contrast your life with hers. What's the same? What's different? And the last one I really also like, what is one contribution that you could make to your community? Because now Malala is going around, she's giving speeches, she's giving talks, she has a foundation, she's contributing to society. So ask the students, for you in your community, in your situation, how could you make a contribution? So you don't have to do all of these, but just add one thing that gets them to think outside of the box a little bit. So use what you already have. We don't want to recreate the wheel, as we say. You don't want to have to redo everything. Use what you have and supplement here and there with some real world application and some questions. Okay, so when we think about this, open-ended questions, they make students process the information instead of just remembering it. And that's what we want to move toward. Not just remembering, but processing information more deeply. And that whole change in perspective, when you put yourself in someone else's shoes, that makes the thinking task more challenging. And it gets them to think more deeply. Comparing and contrasting really causes a lot of analysis and thinking about that. And connecting or empathizing with a peer in their situation that is different from our own really helps with critical thinking, because it helps you to think of a reality that's not like your own, which really takes some deep critical thinking. So I would encourage you to just add a little bit to what you already have in your unit. Okay, Next, I would really focus on making questions a daily practice. In every class session you have, I know you probably only see them 3 times a week, but whenever you have your students, make questions a regular habit. And I know that if your students are new to this, it will take time, so start slow, but really start to make it something that they know is going to be in every class so that they become more comfortable with that. So you could start by asking a question every day. So when they come into class, there's a question of the day that they need to think about, and you could start your class that way. Or you could have it as the end, you know, the last 5 or 10 minutes, you know, okay, we're going to just think about this question and we're going to do some small group talking about it. If you want to up the challenge, you could ask students to bring in a question of the day. So you have a group of students and everyone brings a question that they all have to ask. If your students struggle with asking questions out loud, I would strongly encourage you to find a way to allow for silent questioning. What I mean is a way for students to write down questions and submit them somehow instead of being nervous to speak in class. So a couple of ideas are, one is a question box. I know that teachers move around, so you may not want to bring a box, but it could be a little bag or something. But at the end of class, students put questions inside of it, and then the teacher responds in the next class to those questions. If you do have your own classroom that you don't move around, if you have a space, we call it like a parking lot for questions. So you have like a question wall, a space on the wall, and students can write a question on the post-it note and put it on the wall. They don't have to put their name on it unless you want to. And they can stick it on the wall. And again, you could address those questions at a later time. So this could be a way to start students into it if they're feeling a little nervous about asking questions out loud. Use partners and groups to reduce anxiety. Okay, so talking about things in a big group can be nerve-wracking for students who are not confident. So use partners and groups when you can. This is great on Zoom. This is why I love Zoom in classes, because those breakout rooms are so good for things like this. This may not work for you, but in the United States, in our, like when I've taught listening speaking classes, participation is always part of the grade, which I know may seem a little difficult to do. I don't know if this is common in Japan, but we make it like 5 or 10% of the grade. And so they know that they need to practice. One idea is to have students keep track of their own participation. So if they ask a question, they can just write it down. On this day, kind of keep a log. So this is one thing, if you are willing or able to try, it's really helpful and useful that they know an expectation of the class is to participate. So use it if that works for you. It might not work for you. The third thing that I want to encourage you to do is to consider Bloom's taxonomy. And so I don't know if you're familiar with this. It was created in the 1950s by a man named Benjamin Bloom. And so it's a taxonomy to categorize our thinking level. And so the goal is to start at the bottom and to move up to the top. So and it's been revised a little bit. This is the newest version, the most recent updated version. So if you look at the bottom one is remembering. So just recalling relevant information. So memorization, things like that. So I feel like Japanese students are really great at this bottom level, this bottom category. Okay. But we need to move up a little bit. So once students are able to remember and recall, we need them to understand. They need to be able to make sense of the material and deeply understand it. Not just remember it, but understand what the content was. Then, once you've done that, applying. So applying the information that they have to real life, to a situation, to solve a problem. And then we move into analyzing. So showing how information relates to each other, to really think about the parts, to analyze critically the deeper parts of information. And then evaluating. So this is making judgments, forming opinions. Okay, so some critical evaluation here. And then the top one is creating. So being creative, designing, being innovative with the information that you have. That really pushes people to think critically because it's all just about making something that is new. So our goal is to move up. The bottom three are considered lower order thinking skills, and the top three are considered higher order. So I want you to think about this and really apply it to your specific students. So don't think, oh, I have to get my students through all of these levels in 1 year. Maybe that's not realistic. Start where your students are and move up. Okay, this is the goal, right? This is where you need to go, but you need to think about what's realistic and how you're going to get your students through these groups. So start slow and small. Don't say, okay, today we're gonna do remembering, tomorrow we're gonna do understanding. No, start slow, see how students do. Like I said, we need to be flexible and adapt and pay attention to how our students are responding, and then go from there. So adapt to your students' abilities. See how they're doing with the understanding and the applying. You may need to stay there for a while. Maybe you're not gonna get to analysis. Maybe that's going to be next year for them, but you just know the direction you need to go in. When you get into the higher level, the harder stages of critical thinking, you really need to scaffold more, which means support your students more, because it's much harder for them to do. The remembering, they can do it without a lot of support because they just have to remember. But when you get up into analysis and things like that, they need more help from you. Maybe you need to simplify the English. So what happens a lot of times is when tasks get harder, for some reason, the English also gets harder, like in textbooks and things like that. But when you have a hard task, you need to lower the level of English. So maybe do a harder task with something that they really know a lot about, something relevant to their lives, like anime or something. So you need to simplify the English. Or maybe you need to use more Japanese when you're explaining something. Our goal is to get students to think critically. Our goal is not always that you talk to them in English the whole time, because they might need a little bit of support as you're trying to move them toward that more critical thinking. I know that we always say use English all the time, but for scaffolding, you may need to use more Japanese and easier English in those higher order thinking levels. So that's something to consider. I want to show you an example with an elementary reading book. It's called Pa Leah's First Day. So it's about an immigrant who goes to school and her first day at school, which is very challenging. First day in a new school is always really difficult. So I want to show you how these questions look like with the different stages of Bloom's taxonomy. So for this first stage, the answers, the questions are very straightforward, very direct, and you could probably just find the answer in the reading. So what, when, where, these questions. What did Pa Leah's brother do? They just need to find it. Who pushed Pa Leah on the steps? What name did Stinky call Pa Leah? So it's just a matter of finding the answer. It's very straightforward. Okay, these are great. This is where you need to start, right? So start here. Then as you're moving up into that next level of understanding, you need students to show you that they understand. Too many times we ask students, do you understand? And they say, yes. But we don't know that they understand because we haven't asked them to show us. So questions can help do that. Why did Pa Leah dawdle on the way to school? They need to be able to tell us. How will Pa Leah find her classroom? These are not things you just find. They need to show that they understand what was happening in the story. Why was Howie mean to Palia? Why did she get into trouble? Okay. So some summarizing, some retelling is important in this understand phase. And then to apply, students try to solve problems or apply the information to a task. How would you do if you needed to find your classroom on the first day of school? So they're taking Palia's experience and applying it to, what if that were you? Could also have them list the ways that you could make a new student feel welcome. So this was Palia's terrible experience. What could you do to make a new student welcome? If she was in your school, what could you have done? And what questions would you ask Stinky if you could talk to him? Okay, so really getting students to apply what they know to a task of some kind. And then we're going deeper with the analysis. So this is the higher order where you're starting to see that maybe students can't respond in English, even though they're processing the information. That's okay. You need to meet students where they are. If they can, that's great. If they can't, you know, negotiate that with a little bit more Japanese help. How do we know Palia felt nervous? Find the sentences. So this is more about inference. So if the sentence says she was, you know, wringing her hands together, that tells us she was nervous, or maybe she was biting her fingernails. So it has some analysis where you have to infer a little bit. Look at the words in the word bank that describe people. Put them in the categories for the different characters. So you're going deeper into character analysis. How do you know that Palia is the hero? So, you know, a lot of times we know this is the hero, but ask the students, how do you know that? What in the story makes us know that she's the hero of the story? Then we're getting into evaluation. So this is so difficult for students who are not used to forming opinions. So again, it could require some scaffolding. What do you think will happen if Palia does not tell the truth? What didn't you like about the story? This is an evaluative question. What didn't you like about it? So that gives the student permission to say, I didn't like this, but they need to tell you why. Do you think Toger was a good brother? Why or why not? That why or why not is such an important question. Because you could just stop with, do you think Toger was a good brother? Yes. No. If you stop there, that's not thinking critically. Why or why not? I like this next one a lot. What part of this book did you like best? And tell me why. Okay. So think about what you like about the story, what you don't like about the story. So if you have a unit, just adding that one question. What did you like about the story? What didn't you like about the story? That's just one question that you could add to your lesson that adds some critical thinking. And then our top level of creation. Students use the information to create something new. So for your creative students, this is a chance for them to actually use that, because so many times students who are creative, if they're stuck in a school environment that's only about remembering, they don't get to use that. So this is a great time for some of those students to shine. But it's new, so it may take some time to get them used to it. Polly is a new student. She has no friends. Write a booklet of advice for new students at your school. So if we have new students here at our school, let's make a booklet that helps them figure out where to go, what to do. I love the second one. Can you invent another character for the story? So create a whole new character. Who would that be? What would they do? And so many of your students are artistic, right? You know, they can draw really well, maybe not, but sometimes they can. This is a great time for them to do that. And then the last two are so good. How could you change the story? So the plot in the story, how could you change that? How else could Palia make friends? And then a great one for any story is, how would you change the ending? You know, if you've watched a movie before and you're like, oh, that ending was terrible. Like, we've all experienced that. I hated that ending. How would you change it? So adding that piece could be so helpful to allow students to think more deeply. So when we think about this, you can Google these things very easily. I have a list of resources at the end of this presentation, and we will post this so you can see it later. But this is not the whole list. I only took a screenshot of part of it. It's a long list. But this can help you to figure out what words you can use in the different levels to ask students to do things. Okay, so you see and remember, we've got cite or define, identify, label. Then you get up to understanding, classify, compare, characterize, and apply, adapt, alphabetize, assign, attain, analyze, break down, classify, compare, evaluate. You've got conclude, so you could make a conclusion, kind of an opinion. Critique, this is a great word. Critique this. So the ending, critique the ending. What was good about it? What wasn't good about it? And then the create, animate, assemble, combine. There are more. This is a long list. So you can just Google Bloom's taxonomy verbs, and I'm sure you'll get there's so many resources on the internet about Bloom's taxonomy. Also, one thing that is really helpful for us as teachers anytime are question stems. So the beginning of a question. And this is also helpful when we think about Bloom's taxonomy. So again, this is a screenshot, so you don't see all of them, but you can go to the resource at the end, or you can just Google Bloom's taxonomy question stems. So if you look at the very top, you can see in the first remember category, when, where, what is. In the orange, the comprehension, that understand phase, retell this story in your own words. What is the main idea of? And it gives you some verbs there at the top. Paraphrase, restate, rewrite, summarize. Then we get into application. How is X an example of Y? How is this related to that? Why is this significant? And again, it gives you the verbs that you could use. Demonstrate, determine, conclude, give an example. And then again, you go down into analysis. So everything's cut off here at the end, but you can Google this, or you can look at my resource at the end and find question stems. So it's a great little cheat sheet for us as teachers. If we're not sure what to do, just start using some of these question stems that are already written for you. Maybe keep it in your planner so that you can occasionally just add it to your lessons here and there. So you can start by thinking of it as that, salt and pepper, just to sprinkle it in your lesson plans a little bit here and there to enhance your lesson. We don't need to change everything all at once if that's not what you're comfortable with. So these are great ways to sprinkle some critical thinking into your lessons. So I wanted to give you some other strategies that I don't have time to go into. Each of these could be a whole webinar on its own. So project-based learning is really critical when you think about getting your students to think more deeply. So using projects is so helpful because they're applying the information, they're doing something that's authentic and that's real world. So you can Google this. There's so much information around these topics. There's a lot to read about these topics, but putting projects into your lessons are really helpful for critical thinking, because there's not just, A, B, C questions to answer, one answer for each one. This is more abstract and there are fewer boundaries. So students have to think more critically. But it also takes that ambiguity for you as a teacher to be okay, because you're not really sure where it's going to go. So that's a challenge for us as teachers if we're more used to knowing exactly what's going to happen in our classes. Another thing you could Google is utilizing the habits of mind. So there are 16 habits of mind, and they're not all critical for you maybe as English teachers, but things like thinking flexibly, Things like questioning and posing problems, or reflecting, which is in the next one, or, you know, there's a lot in there. And so trying to get students to lean in this direction is another thing that you could look into. Regular reflection is also so important. When you have students to stop and reflect about what they're learning, how they're doing, what they're struggling with, what they're not struggling with, so that inner introspection is really important for education. I started adding reflection when in my writing classes. I added a reflection assignment for every writing unit that we did. And that was so important, but it was very difficult for students to do because it wasn't cut and dry. So it caused them to think more deeply and think about how they were doing or reflecting about a topic. And then the last one is really useful, and something that I've done a lot in my teaching is what they call RAFT assignments. So RAFT stands for role, audience, format, and topic. So when you can change the role, when you can change the audience, change the format, or change the topic. So I'm going to give you an example of what I have done in the last several years with my writing class. So I was teaching a writing class, and it was all opinion writing. It was a high-level class, but we chose opinion writing because students couldn't do it very well. So most of my students were from Asia here at the University of Kansas. So I had students from China, Japan, Korea, and also from the Middle East. So I designed this class to focus on what they struggled with the most, which is opinion writing. So first of all, I had my students choose their own topic. I gave them some guidance, but they chose their own topic, which that by itself is critical thinking. It's very difficult. I spent a lot of time in class on choosing their topic. It didn't just happen like this. It took some scaffolding and some support for them. And over the course of one semester, I had them write 4 different writing assignments, all about the same topic. So the first one was just an opinion paragraph. What is your opinion about your topic? Then they had to write a formal proposal. They had to propose to a formal audience, so someone in authority, that something change. Then they had to write an op-ed, an opinion editorial like you would see in a magazine or a newspaper. Same topic, but they had to switch it. And the audience were their peers. So I was at a university and we had a student newspaper. And so I told them that you need to write this where you're asking your students to do something about this topic, to enact change, but your audience were your peers. So they had to switch the audience. And then the last assignment was a formal research paper. So they took their opinion paragraph and they expanded it into a formal research paper with a counter argument, which acknowledges the other side's position. Okay, so this is what we did in my class. So students had to change the role. They had to change the audience. So they had to think about who they're talking to. They had to change vocabulary. They had to change grammar. And then obviously they changed the format. Students kind of liked making it look like a newspaper. We had the newspaper format and they put their picture like they're the author. This whole unit really made them think flexibly and what we actually call rhetorical flexibility. But they struggled. And it's okay. Sometimes we get frustrated. Our students are struggling. That means that good things are happening when students are struggling. So some students, it took one girl 6 weeks to even understand what an opinion was. I remember this very clearly. So some of my students really struggled with forming an opinion. They struggled when they had to switch the audience. They struggled after the formal proposal. So writing to someone in authority, like your principal or the governor of Tokyo, and then they had to switch to writing to their peers. They really struggled because they wanted to just copy and paste, but you have to change the tone. You have to change the vocabulary and the grammar. You talk differently to your peers than you do to someone in authority. So that was difficult. And they had trouble thinking about the other side's position. They struggled, but then they got there. And I didn't put this on here, I should have. But they really, at the end of the semester, almost every semester I did this, students felt confident. And they looked at what they did and they said, I did that. And they didn't think they'd be able to, and they did. And some students even went on to actually write op-eds for real life newspapers or things. They submitted their own thoughts. So it empowered them to think, I have a voice that I can use. So it really was a wonderful unit for them, and some great things happened. And I'm sorry I put that in the right so you can't see it. But the struggle is important and necessary. So when we see our students struggle, that means that good things are happening. As long as they're not struggling with something that's completely out of their reach, that's not good. But a little bit of struggle is a natural part of critical thinking and of learning. So whenever I saw students struggle, I said, yep, this is good. They're going to work through it and they're going to move to more critical thinking on the other side. So don't be afraid of the struggle. Just make sure you're supporting them and guiding them through that. So as we wrap up, when you think about critical thinking, don't expect too much too soon. Really know your students and just start sprinkling in that critical thinking so that you're moving them in that direction. Do it consistently. Do something in every class, even if it's just adding a why question, a why or why not question, or what did you like, what didn't you like? And give students and yourself time to adjust, because this is, like I said, a huge task to get your students to become critical thinkers, and you need to give them time to adjust. These are my resources that if you want to look at it later, you can find a lot of the things that I showed you about the verbs and question stems and things like that. Okay, we have time now for Q&A. So I would like to ask you to use the Q&A button at the bottom and not the chat. When you put a question, please address it to everyone so that everyone can see it. And also please write it in English because my Japanese is terrible. I can say about 5 words. So please ask any questions that you have. And before you go, there is a survey. It's just 4 questions. If you could please answer that before you go, it would really help us to know how to make these webinars better for you in the future. So if you have questions, please put that in the chat box. It always takes a little bit of time for them to start coming in. Maybe no one has questions. I don't know. Okay, please use the Q&A button and not the chat. Okay, we have a question here. I sometimes feel it's difficult to wrap up the student's idea. I'm not quite sure what you mean by wrap up the student's idea. You mean summarize their idea? If you could tell me a little bit more about that, that would help. Do you think critical thinking can be introduced to the language learning beginners like junior and high school? Yes, I think you can even start in elementary school by asking why. Yeah, I think you can start this early. You know, in the United States, we start this in preschool. So asking why, what do you think? Do you like, so for an elementary student, do you like this picture? Why? What do you like about it? So you can start very early when you do this. So definitely with junior high, for sure. Okay, Chiho, hi. How can we improve our students' ability of reading between the lines? So I would start small. And so I would start by saying, what do we see? And then what does this tell us? So I would really look at the vocabulary, and I would look at what does that word mean? So if you're talking about, oh, this is hard without a reading in front of me, but for example, if they're describing a situation and they're saying the girl, you know, had a frown, or the girl was surprised and said blah, 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 blah. Why was she surprised? So really just starting simple and saying, okay, this is what we see. Why do you think that? So I know this is not really the most concise answer, but really starting with looking at what's on the page, taking it step by step. What do we see? And so what do we think about that? So taking it step by step. That was a terrible and not concise answer, Chiho, but we can talk about this later if you want. Okay, tell me what a op-ed. So at least in the West, in a newspaper, there's always an opinion editorial where someone will write an article about their opinion. So you see it in every single newspaper edition. So if you look at the New York Times, you'll look at the op-ed section, and that's where someone will give an example or give their opinion about whatever. So you have a new prime minister. Maybe someone would write an op-ed about what they think about the choice of the new prime minister. So that is an op-ed. So people just write about their own opinion. For an actual class, critical thinking is time consuming. Do you have a good suggestion? I don't think it is time consuming, but I think that's why you can just sprinkle in here and there. But I think you need to balance what your goals are. If your goals are a language class where you want your students to use English authentically, then this is time well spent. So I would really think about how you're using your time, and I would carve out the time for critical thinking because it's so important, especially for language use, because authentic tasks help students to actually use the English. And so first of all, I would just start adding a little bit here and there, but it is time that you need to spend. And I think it's more worthwhile than spending it on, you know, just answering questions that are easily found. So I would spend the time because it's worth it. How do you evaluate students' achievement? That's a whole other topic. So it starts with setting clear objectives that you and the students both know, and then writing clear rubrics that let you and the students know what it is you're assessing, and then going from there. So rubrics and assessment is a whole other topic, but make your objectives clear and make the rubric on how you will assess them clear. Yes. Do schools in the US often apply Bloom's taxonomy? Yes, all the time. In professional development, every teacher in the United States knows about Bloom's taxonomy. Every teacher, because this is something that is just part of our training. And so my brother, he's not a teacher, but he's been asked to teach one class at university, and he called me and he said, Jenny, explain Bloom's taxonomy because they tell me I have to use it. So in the US, this is like water for educators. Is there a good and easy way to change from teacher-centered class to student-centered? Facilitating sometimes requires training. It does require training for sure, but I would start by thinking about how you ask questions. That could be a way to make it student-centered. Also, creating a project along with your unit that's student-centered. So anytime that you are using an applicable skill, that is student-centered. But I do agree with you. I think it does require training, which I don't believe you have enough of in Japan. And so I agree with you. But starting with just putting these questions in, that's a good place to start. Do you have tips in order to ask open-ended questions? Yeah, so go back and use those question stems that I showed you. That would be where I would start. Is it enough just to share students' answers when we ask questions at higher levels of Bloom's taxonomy? I don't think, and what are some good ways to respond? I don't think it's important. The importance is what students are asking, not your response. But maybe I'm not quite sure what you're asking. But yeah, what students are sharing is the process. That is the learning there. And so I think, yeah, that is what you can focus on. Okay, we're getting a lot of assessment questions, so maybe we need to do a webinar on assessment. Okay, another person, I have difficulty asking open-ended questions. Yeah, so that's when you rely on those question stems that are already written for you. So I would rely on those. Okay, I love this question. It sounds fun to ask open questions. However, it takes time and it may be difficult to finish the lesson. How do you manage the syllabus? Also, it takes a lot of time to evaluate students' writing if you assign the writing test. Okay, so this is one thing that I think is a major systemic change that needs to happen. So open-ended questions, we don't do it because it's fun. We do it because that's how students learn. And so I think it is a challenge when you have a syllabus and you have to get everything done, right? And so that's when I would ask administrators or the head of an English department, look at your English program and look at your goals. Because what's frustrating is you're being asked to do critical thinking with your students without really changing the expectations of everything else you're doing. Entrance exam, these tests, this and that. So it's like two worlds clashing and you don't have time to do both. So first, I would encourage you to think of open-ended questions not as fun, even though it can be, but as critical for thinking and learning. And because that is true, I would think about as a program, as your department, how can you adjust your syllabus to allow for more time to do this, because it's not fun. And I got this a lot when I was in Japan, like student-centered is fun. That's not why we do it. We do it because that's how students learn and how they learn to speak authentically. So I appreciate your challenge because of your syllabus. That's where I think more change needs to happen at the higher levels of administration. I'm teaching 12-year-old kids. If I ask open questions, they would make grammatically incorrect sentences as they don't know the rules yet. To what degree do you think those mistakes should be allowed? And how do you think teachers should evaluate? So I don't think that that's really a problem when you're asking open-ended questions. As you teach grammar, I would focus on one thing to correct. So you say, okay, today we're going to think about our verbs and, present tense. So we're going to look at that and focus on that. But I know this is a switch in Japan, but when you're asking open-ended questions, your goal is that they're thinking. Your goal is not that they're responding perfectly. So I would allow for mistakes. So many questions I had to choose. If students mention their ideas about the topic after asking open questions, how should I react as a facilitator? Should I have sympathetic comments or something else? Yeah, so this is a good question. So when students respond, give a thought, I do respond and move on. So I really try not to respond too much to a student because I want more students to respond. So I will validate them and say, that's an interesting thought. Anyone else have another thought? And so I don't spend a lot of time engaging in a back and forth with that student about their thoughts, because the goal is that students are sharing their thoughts, not that I'm responding to their thoughts. I hope that answers your question. Okay, this is a great question. I'm really bad at critical thinking and not creative. I'm not creative either. To begin with, what can I do to change my way of thinking before teaching students? So the first thing I would do is to use things like question stems that are already written for you. So utilize things that are already done for you, like question stems. I would also really encourage you to collaborate with other teachers. If you go to an event and you meet a teacher and you make a connection, keep that connection. I really wish that more collaboration would happen in Japan. So many times I saw teachers doing everything in isolation on their own, and we need to work together. Teachers in the United States, we are just used to sharing ideas. For example, when I do a webinar, when I do anything, I see what other people have done first and I get ideas from them. So my advice is start with question stems that are already written for you. Don't try to be too creative at first, just start small. Get ideas from other teachers and go from there, would be my advice. Okay, I didn't talk about assessment because that is a huge other topic. So I'm getting a lot of assessment questions. And a lot of evaluation questions. So maybe we need to do an assessment question or webinar. And we are out of time. Maybe we can just do one more. Even if students have something to say to why questions or how questions, they often struggle partly because they have a limited vocabulary. Also, they need to use words and expressions that are not in their text to give their opinions. How do you think we can support students on this point? Okay, so let's say you're in an English class, but you want to add some critical thinking. Critical thinking is your goal. Ideally, we would love for students to think critically in English, but that's not the goal. So if they can think critically, if they can respond in Japanese to what they have read in English, that shows critical thinking. We just want to see that they have thought critically. So if they do that in Japanese, that's a great way to start. And then eventually, as they gain vocabulary, they'll be able to do it in English. But your goal is the thinking. So think about how to do that in any language that they can do it in. Okay, so we are out of time. Thank you so much for your questions. I appreciate it, and I hope something here was useful for you. Have a wonderful weekend, and we'll see you another time.